Greetings, everyone. This is Robert Landau, Live Life Well TV host. We're here with the second episode in a brand new show here on Live Life Well TV that we call Crazy Fun Facts. Why would we ever call a weekly episodic show Crazy Fun Facts? Well, because we're going to be sharing with you some crazy fun facts. It's that simple, it's that crazy, it's that fun. If you missed the first episode, go back to Crazy Fun Facts episode 1 and check out the facts that we shared concerning the iconic Empire State Building. For this episode 2, we're going to actually stay in New York City because we're going to be talking about this nation's, I would say, number one entertainment district, our nation's number one entertainment venue. So much history and so many crazy and fun facts to it. We're going to be talking to you about Broadway, so it's time to take your seat because the curtain's about to go up. Stay tuned. So, before the overture begins, we would like to acknowledge not one, not two, but 3 websites, and they are headout.com, lovingnewyork.com, and factinate.com. So here we go. You might have heard what Broadway happened to have been referred to earlier. It was known, and some people still talk about this, as the Great White Way. But in this day and age, you better be careful when you say something like that because it has another connotation to it, which isn't very positive. But that has nothing to do with it because the theater district, Broadway, was one of the first streets in New York to be fully illuminated by white electric bulbs way back in the 1890s, thus giving rise to the nickname, the Great White Way. Aha! Ever since 1910, the Broadway signage was illuminated with incandescent bulbs as architects realized the advertising potential of dazzling lights, hence adding to the lights of the streets. When the lights of Broadway were dimmed during World War I, public demand forced the government to increase the city's coal ration to restore the bright white lights of Broadway. If you didn't know before, Broadway is the longest street in New York City. Broadway runs for 33 whole miles. Now, that's the street of Broadway. That is not necessarily the district of Broadway. Man, that'd be a lot of Broadway theaters in that stretch, don't you think? So Broadway, the street in New York City on the island of Manhattan, runs for 33 whole miles, of which 18 miles are not even within New York City limits. It begins from Lower Manhattan at Bowling Green and runs to the North Bronx all the way to Albany out of New York. It is one of the oldest north-south thoroughfares in New York City and has roots traced back to Native American times. The first written reference of the term Broadway on maps was seen, get this, in the 1700s. During the Dutch settlement in America, the Broadway street was called Brede Weg, B-R-E-D-E, next word W-E-G. The name Broadway is the literal English translation of the earlier known Dutch name. There is no row I, the letter I, in Broadway theaters. So why is that? And it's a very interesting thing. There is no Broadway theater that has a row that's called letter I row. While rows A through H and J through Z are present in each Broadway theater, there is not, as I said before, a row I. There were too many people getting disappointed when they realized that their row 1 was actually 9 rows up, and it was the letter I and not the letter 1. So to prevent any further disappointment, any further confusion, the row letter I does not exist in Broadway theaters. This rule was imposed when people started flocking to the front seat, the front row, with their I ticket designation, and some fights actually had to be subdued. So that was that. Have you seen this next Broadway show? I think just about everybody has, and maybe you saw the film, but the Broadway show of Phantom of the Opera happens to be the longest running Broadway show. Now, of course, as of this filming, Broadway is just starting to open up after a very long and quiet year because of COVID. I just can't even imagine what all those wonderful Broadway performers, Broadway musicians, Broadway backstage people, Broadway box office people, ushers and usherettes were doing over this last year. But thank God, the lights of Broadway in terms of the performances, shows, it's starting to come back. The Phantom of the Opera will probably come back too, but it opened on Broadway back in 1988 and was, until COVID, running on its 4th decade of stellar performances. 2018 marked its 30th anniversary, and in those 30 years, get this, over 12,500 performances have been staged to over 18 million people. The box office revenues for Phantom of the Opera are higher than any film or stage play in history, including Titanic, E.T., Star Wars, and the movie Avatar. It's an amazing fact. 15 actors have played the role of the Phantom on Broadway in 30 years, with about 5 temporary replacements on top of that. Norm Lewis was the first African-American actor to perform the role of the Phantom on Broadway, and a guy by the name of Ali Ewoldt was the first Asian American to be cast in the role of Christine. So it's not a guy, it's actually a girl. And she was the first Asian actress to play Christine in Phantom of the Opera on Broadway. Chicago, the musical, is the second longest running Broadway show. The original Chicago production, choreographed and directed by the one and only Bob Fosse, opened back in 1975. Gwen Verdon and Chita Rivera headed a stupendous cast, and that first run of Chicago ran for no less than 936 performances. Gwen Verdon had to leave for medical reasons for a while during that run, and Bob Fosse tapped the one and only Liza Minnelli to perform along with Chita Rivera during Gwen's absence from the show. After 1977, Chicago was revived on Broadway in a different type of production, but exactly the same Broadway show. And it opened on Broadway in 1996. Chicago now ranks as Broadway's longest running revival, having played in 24 countries in no less than 12 languages as well. As of 2018, more than 8,000 performances have been clocked in on Broadway. Chicago is based on a real-life 1924 Windy City murder case that was transformed by reporter Maureen Watkins into a 1926 Broadway comedy. It's a great show. Great show. And so is Phantom. In a way, what Broadway show isn't great? But you're hearing that from a true fan. Lion King happens to be the highest grossing Broadway show. Disney's Lion King is Broadway's biggest moneymaker in history. In the 20 years that it has run on Broadway, the show has grossed, get this, $1.4 billion with an average of $2 million a week. It is also the first ever Broadway show to gross $1 billion in revenue. And it is, have you seen it? It's incredible, unforgettable. Julie Taymor, the director of The Lion King, became the first woman in Broadway history to win the Tony Award for Best Director in a Musical. And boy, did she ever deserve that. The first ever nude Broadway production was Hair. Hair, which you might have known or remember, or maybe saw it, was the tribal American love rock musical. That's what it was known as, a product of the hippie counterculture and sexual revolution of the late 1960s. Hair opened on Broadway in 1968 and ran for 1,750 performances. Though it had an off-Broadway debut, its Broadway revival back in 2009 earned strong reviews and the Tony Award and Drama Desk Award for Best Revival of a Musical. The most controversial element in that show was a brief nude scene where the entire cast ended the first act. Some of the songs from Hair's music score were in the top 10 hits of the period, and there was also a movie made of the musical back in 1979. Speaking of nude shows on Broadway, I was an actor in New York City before I started cruise directing around the world. And so I had a lot of friends in various Broadway shows, and you'd hear a lot of stuff, very interesting stuff. But a roommate of mine, because I couldn't afford to live alone in New York City, because at that time, and it still is, rather expensive, just to say the least. But a roommate of mine for about, I think, 6 months was in a show on Broadway. I think it might have been even designated off Broadway, but it was in the Broadway Theater District called Oh, Calcutta. Now, unlike Hair, where there was just one number, one scene where everybody was naked, Oh, Calcutta, pretty much the whole show, all the cast was naked. And my roommate was in the cast. And I asked him one day, I think his name was Tom. I said, Tom, how do you do that? How do you be on stage for 2 hours with an intermission, totally naked, in front of people 8 times a week? And he said, you know, Robert, I don't even think about it. It's just perfectly natural to me. And I'm more than happy to be in a show like Oh, Calcutta. Kudos to him. I could never have done it. So here's another crazy fun fact. You might have heard of the Palace Theater. It's an incredible Broadway theater right on Times Square. The Palace Theater, where Judy Garland had her famous run of concerts, and so many other people have performed there, and Broadway shows were there. It is said to be haunted. Amongst the many Broadway theaters that are believed to be haunted, the Palace Theater is said to have, get this, almost 100 spirits that supposedly stalk that theater. The most frequent phantom is allegedly Judy Garland, who performed, as I said, in that theater for many years in the past. Many people have seen her appear near the door in the orchestra pit. So how about that? The other common visitor, ghost-wise, that people claim to have seen more than once is somebody by the name of Louis Basalina. He was an acrobat who was gravely injured during a high wire act in the Palace Theater all the way back in 1935, when the Palace Theater was a vaudeville house. Wow. 66% of Broadway audiences are female. In the 20th demographics of the Broadway audience, which was from 2016 to 2017, the annual report published by the Broadway League, it was found that 66% of the audiences that go to see Broadway shows are women. Also, in that study, there were 13.3 million admissions to Broadway shows between the years of 2016 and 2017. 13.3 million people in that window of years, 2016 to 2017, saw a Broadway show. The research also showed that approximately 50% of respondents said that they purchased their Broadway tickets online. Way before that became a possibility, when I was living in New York City, I was living a block or two away from the theater district, the Broadway theater district. So I used to walk everywhere in New York City by foot. Very rarely would I take the subway unless where I was going was so far from where I lived. But I would walk, and I would usually walk through the Broadway theater district to get to where I wanted to be. And right at Times Square, we'll see if that's going to be there once Broadway reopens soon. But there was the famous half-price tickets booth, and you could get amazing deals on shows that day that did not sell out, because rather than take that loss, those theaters would send their free seats, their vacant seats, to the half-price tickets booth, and you could get a half-price ticket anywhere that was available in a Broadway theater for a Broadway show, and it was a great deal. So what you'd have to do is get there an hour at least earlier than when it was going to open that day. That's at least what I did, because the lines were long. And once you got closer to purchasing a ticket, there was a listing of what Broadway shows were available that day. And you'd pick maybe 2 or 3 of them. And once I got to the window, the ticket office there at the half-price tickets booth, I would ask what was available for, let's say, The Lion King. And they would tell me where those seats were. And if I didn't like where they were, then I would ask for my second show, and so on and so forth. But here's what I used to do. Don't tell anyone. Because I lived in the theater district, when there's an intermission of a Broadway show, most of the people seeing it will spill out into the street in front of the theater to take an intermission break. That's when I would sneak into the theater and stand in the standing room area to see the second act of many shows, because as a struggling actor, I couldn't afford to buy a regular ticket, particularly if a show was sold out and I couldn't get half-price tickets. I saw a lot of them second act. The second act. I saw Liza Minnelli in a musical called The Act. And the big number from that musical actually happens at the beginning of the second act. So it was perfect. But don't tell her, please. Broadway plays have been controversial over the years. There have been some controversial moments in the history of Broadway, performances of counterculture shows like Hair, like Oh Calcutta, as were things that I've already mentioned here. But the show, the musical, The Book of Mormon, by the creators of South Park, has caused controversy for its highly irreverent take on religion. But not many plays can beat the one called Sex by Mae West, which opened on Broadway in 1926 and was shut down in the middle of the performance by a police raid. The police said the play was obscene and arrested the entire cast, including Mae West. Mae West spent 10 days in jail, but that kind of publicity can be priceless because due to that, she went on to a very successful Hollywood film career. Publicity, dear friends, is everything. So maybe you should tell Liza Minnelli that I sneaked in on the second half of the act to see her sing City Lights. And maybe that publicity will make me a star. Hollywood, here I come. Get ready. Ha! New York City's shows on Broadway attract more than 13 million spectators annually, as we said before. And just to put that into perspective, that is more than Belgium's entire population. That's astounding. You might have heard of the hit Broadway show Hamilton. It leads the list of the most Tony Award nominations. If you don't know what the Tony Awards are, you've probably seen them on TV, but just in case, they are like the Academy Award, but they're called the Tonys for excellence on the Broadway stage. Out of 26 Tony Award categories, the musical Hamilton was nominated for 16 back in 2016. That is more than any other single production since the first Tony Awards were held back in 1947. At the end of that Tony Awards night in 2016, Hamilton took home no less than 11 Tony Awards. That is amazing. Have you ever heard of Broadway shows being dark? And what that means is, out of a very hectic weekly schedule, most Broadway shows do not perform. There are no Broadway shows, mostly on Mondays. So what they're saying by the show being dark means that the theater is not lit inside. The lights are off, so it is dark. Generally, Broadway shows take place 8 times a week. So that would be Tuesday evening, Wednesday matinee, Wednesday evening, Thursday evening, Friday evening, Saturday matinee, and Saturday evening, and Sunday matinee. If you're in a Broadway show, you have a schedule like that, you desperately want to be off Mondays. The oldest operating theater on Broadway is one that I have seen a number of shows in over the years. It's called the Lyceum. In 1903, the Lyceum Theater was built. And when Broadway reopens, so will the Lyceum Theater. While most people are familiar with The Wizard of Oz through the incredible 1936 film with Judy Garland, the book originally took to the stage way back in 1902 as a vaudeville type operetta. The show contained 60 songs and had significant changes from the book, including the physical absence of the Wicked Witch of the West, a smaller role for the Cowardly Lion, and a cow, yes, a cow named Imogene in place of Toto the dog. The show back then was a hit, however, and ran for 293 performances on Broadway. In the 1970s, African American influenced musical styles, such as a show called a show featuring Motown, shows featuring R&B, funk, and gospel were dominating the radio, and composer Charlie Smalls reworked those styles into a musical based on The Wizard of Oz. It was called The Wiz, and The Wiz opened on Broadway back in 1975. What an incredible show that was. I was fortunate enough to see it. It was an all African-American cast. It was a retelling of The Wizard of Oz in musical Broadway form. It was stupendous. It started the career of one of the best singers that I know, Stephanie Mills, who played Dorothy in the show. There was also a film made of The Wiz in 1978, starring Michael Jackson and Diana Ross as Dorothy. Michael Jackson played the Scarecrow, and I think it's Glinda, right? The Good Witch of the North was played by Lena Horne. In that movie of The Wiz, Lena Horne sings a song called If You Believe. It is astounding. It stands so beautifully alone in and of itself, but do see the entire movie if you feel moved to. On July 25th, 1975, a chorus line opened at the Showboat Theater on Broadway. I remember that well. The show told the story of 17 dancers competing for 8 spots in a Broadway chorus and was based on the shared stories of real-life dancers. It loosened the rules for how musicals had to be structured and showed that monologues and songs could be their own plot if they were centered on a single idea. Chorus Line remains the 6th longest running show on Broadway after an astounding, amazing 6,137 performances. Do you remember the song Edelweiss from the Broadway show, The Sound of Music? Yes, before the film, The Sound of Music was a Broadway show. Edelweiss is the last song that Rodgers and Hammerstein ever wrote together. Hammerstein, unfortunately, was suffering from stomach cancer while working on the show. The show-stopping song Memory from the hit Broadway show Cats by Andrew Lloyd Webber has been recorded more than 150 times. Covers include a high-charting version by Barry Manilow and a well-known rendition of the one and only Barbra Streisand. So, 2 more crazy fun facts concerning Broadway before we close. Stephen Sondheim, one of the best American composers of Broadway shows ever, originally wanted the F word to make its musical theater debut in his musical West Side Story. Now, Leonard Bernstein wrote the music to West Side Story, but Stephen Sondheim, before he started writing Broadway shows per se, did the lyrics to West Side Story. But Columbia Records, who released the original cast recording of West Side Story, informed Mr. Sondheim that the use of that word would violate obscenity laws and prevent the show from touring. You remember that song, G Officer Krumke, if you know West Side Story? Well, it kind of ends with a lyric. Uh, I think it's G Officer Krumke, crump you, right? And then the song is over. Well, Sondheim wanted that last two words of that lyric to be not crump you, but something else you. Never made it to the boards. There you go. And finally, the arrival of the musical Showboat on Broadway in 1927 changed the course of Broadway musicals. The characters, for the first time on Broadway, were three-dimensional and realistic, and it successfully integrated music with a plot that portrayed African-American characters in a sympathetic manner. Also, Showboat was one of the first shows to have a plot on Broadway. Before that, most of the shows on Broadway, if they were musicals, were burlesque variety type shows, a la Florence Ziegfeld. So there you have it. Did you learn a couple of things about Broadway? I sure did. I hope you did. And of course, I hope you had fun while doing so. Thank you so much for tuning in. This has been Robert Landau, Live Life Well TV host, with another episode of Crazy Fun Facts.